Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you guys happen to be. Hope you guys are having a great week so far. Little under the weather here today, so excuse me if I've got a little bit of a groggy voice, but that's okay. We'll get through this. We got our super honey. It's gonna be great. But today we're going to be talking about a process, a movement that in many ways had already begun in the United States. And in fact, we alluded to this earlier on in earlier lectures, and we'll talk about it again in subsequent lectures. But it is this concept of manifest destiny. And manifest destiny is a term that was initially coined, originated in the 1840s by a editor by the name of John O'Sullivan. And he talked about the manifest destiny of the United States. And what he meant by this was that it was the purpose, it was the destiny of the United States to overspread the entire North American hemisphere, bringing with them their institutions. That would mean their schools, their religion, their government, that kind of thing, and they would overspread the North American hemisphere. And he refers to this destiny as being providential, and that is God wants it. And it really brings in notions of American exceptionalism, that is, that not only is the United States different from other nations, but it is in fact better than other nations. And one of the things we're going to be making note of this week when we think about manifest destiny is just this larger concept that as the United States spread across the North American hemisphere and what became the United States, it had to remove peoples and it had to remove institutions that, according to many within the United States, not all by any stretch of the imagination, but many, they had to remove institutions that they regarded as inferior to their own. And so native peoples will be removed, Mexicans will be removed, land will be taken by force. We can think of things like the Mexican-American War, which erupts in the 1840s and ends in 1848 with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Basically, what you had was a desire by the United States to really acquire new territory for itself. And there are a lot of folks who are on board with this concept of manifest destiny. We think of people like James K. Polk, who was president of the United States at the time in which the Mexican-American War erupted. We can think of people like John C. Fremont, referred to as the Pathfinder, a man who went out into the American frontier, as it was oftentimes referred to as, and he cartographed it, he mapped it, he wrote about it, and he became a national hero of the American West. He made what was previously unknown to many Americans known, much in the same way that what Lewis and Clark did earlier on in the century. They made what was known out in the region, and this spurs further desires for westward expansion. But not everybody is gung-ho about westward expansion. For example, we can think of people like Abraham Lincoln, for example, who was a congressperson at this time. He opposed the expansion of the United States. There are other senators from different states who opposed the Mexican-American War, for example, believing that the United States was waging war against a sister republic. You may not be aware of this, but Mexico was a republic at this point, and the United States will effectively declare war against Mexico. There's a dispute, actually, between land and who owned the border territory of the Rio Grande. One of the things that happens during the 1830s is Texas gains its independence. And one of the things that Texas wants to do is to be annexed by the United States. But there are a lot of folks within the United States who understand that if we annex that territory, it will cause a war with Mexico. Some folks didn't think that the Mexicans would be able to fight against the United States, and in many ways they really weren't prepared for the armed forces of the U.S., and in the end Mexico loses. But there is this general tendency to want to acquire Texas, as well as other territories, including California. In fact, James K. Polk, when he becomes president, offers to purchase California from Mexico, and Mexico says, no thanks. And once we do win the Mexican-American War, we acquire California right at the time in which gold is discovered there in January 1824, I think it was, by James Marshall and at Coloma. And so gold is discovered, and that definitely facilitates westward expansion because many people move into the territory of California, and they do so in mass numbers. I mean, there's an avalanche of migration that will descend upon California and really change the history not only of the state of California as it will eventually become, but the history of the United States as well. The California Gold Rush is a pivotal moment in American history for many reasons, but it helps to fulfill the California desire for it helps to fulfill Manifest Destiny, because now we can see that we stretch from sea to shining sea. And once California becomes a state of the Union, which it does in 1850, and actually that complicates the issue over slavery, as we'll see in later lectures, that when California comes into the Union as a free state, as a non-slaveholding state in 1850, a compromise is struck, and it's going to raise some serious problems for the country. But we'll get to that at a later time. What are the arguments in favor of Manifest Destiny? Well, obviously there's this concept of Anglo superiority. I think I've already alluded to this. The idea, the notion that American institutions are better than other institutions, and really what you will find is that the United States, and again, not all, I don't want to make broad overgeneralizations, but there's this general tendent belief that if the United States spreads its institutions, its technology, its industrial development, its market revolution, its education, its religion, Christianity, what have you, it would be doing those who don't have access to those things a favor, right? We would be in many ways sort of lifting them up out of a barbarous, uncivilized state and bringing them up into an enlightened state. One of the things that would really help us to think about, or hope that we would think about, is the words that are used. Oftentimes when we talk about Manifest Destiny, at least in traditional narratives, is that these mountain men, Kit Carson and Jim Beckworth and John C. Fremont, among others, you think of people like Calamity Jane, the national heroes of the day. The idea is that these folks went out into a wilderness and tamed the wilderness. They civilized it. And that type of thinking is erroneous, because there are folks who live in this territory, whether they're native peoples, Mexicans, what have you. And although many Americans may not have regarded those civilizations as equal to their own, the truth of the matter is that this region, this westward region, was by no means void of civilization. And that's why I try to refrain from referring to the Americas as the New World or as a frontier, because it was only new to the folks who had never found it before, and it wasn't a frontier, only in the minds of the Americans who are stretching west. But there's definitely this presumption that we are better. There's obviously adventure, the idea that you might be able to start a new life. Definitely land is cheaper in the American West than it is in other parts of the country. By the time that the 1840s, 50s roll around, land has been made very, very cheap to purchase in the West. You could buy a homestead out in that region for really cheap, and you could start a life for yourself in a way that you could not do in New England or in the South. And so you might move west as a means of starting a new life. There's obviously the adventure of going out into the unknown, at least unknown for them. And there's economic opportunity available for folks who can take it. And I think the California Gold Rush is a prime example of that opportunity. Now, as you'll note, there's going to be a lot of folks who come to California looking for gold, and then subsequently in Virginia City, Nevada, at the Comstock lode, there's a major silver rush that is found. In fact, they're still mining the silver out of the Comstock lode there in Virginia City to this day. But there's opportunity out in the American West economically, whether it's finding gold or whether it's building a railroad or whether it's just creating a small farm. The American West offers opportunity. And we still have this idea of the West with us, this idea that there is a place for people to be successful. It's a new sort of venture. And I think California, above any other state, really exemplifies that kind of idea that you can sort of reinvent yourself and make yourself anew. You think of things like the tech industry in California, or you think of Hollywood in California, the gold rush, right? It's always the golden state, the golden dream. The American dream is in many ways the California dream. And Manifest Destiny is going to serve to fulfill that. But there are some definite negative aspects to Manifest Destiny. I think key among those, obviously, is the destruction of native peoples and their cultures. one of the things that historians think about and talk about from time to time is this idea of genocide. And did Native Americans experience a type of genocide? And this is a very difficult question to answer when thinking about the United States as a whole. Because when we talk about the desire for land among many Americans and their push west in order to get it, much of the death that occurred in that process. And let me kind of digress here for a second. I want to argue and say that Manifest Destiny is part of the colonial process. If you think back to when we talked about settler colonialism, and I talked about it being a structure, it's a process, it's something that took a long time. Manifest Destiny is a product of that colonial process. So although we are no longer in the colonial era, colonialism in many ways is still moving itself across the American hemisphere. But I forgot kind of where I was at there. But the move west is going to offer opportunity for folks in ways that they simply could not have had before. And so when we start thinking about Manifest Destiny, we want to think about it both in note its positive and its negative terms. Oh, that's what I was talking about. Yeah, I was talking about genocide. When we talk about Native Americans particularly, and I think they are very central to the discussion of Manifest Destiny because they became the target, if you will, of the negative side of Manifest Destiny. In many ways, Manifest Destiny sort of wiped them off the map in many ways, not just physically, but culturally as well, socially. When we talk about genocide across the entire United States, I think it's difficult to say that genocide happened. Because when we talk about genocide, you have to think about the idea of intent. Did European colonizers, did Americans intend to come to the New World, the Americas, and give diseases to native peoples? The answer to that question is, of course not. They did not intend to do that. It happened, and there definitely are episodes where intent was to spread diseases, right? That happened from time to time. But throughout most of the country, I'm still up in the air on this. I have to argue and believe that that type of genocide it does not reach the level of the definition of genocide. In California, however, it absolutely does. In California, one of the negative aspects of the gold rush, one of the negative aspects of Manifest Destiny was the wholesale slaughter of native Californians. The state government of California and the federal government of the United States subsidized, that is, they paid people to kill and massacre native peoples. In California, when the Spanish initially arrived in 1769 and settled here, there were about 300,000 native Californians. That number was divided by half once the once the United States got acquisition to California, which took the number down to about 150. And then over the next 50 or so years, from about 1850 to 1900, that number dropped to about 30,000. And that had to do largely with wholesale massacres. Many Oregonians who came down into California for the gold rush hated native peoples, feared them, and they slaughtered them and they killed them. Now, they didn't use the word genocide because that term didn't exist until after the Holocaust in the 1940s. But I think it's easy to say, okay, based upon the definition of genocide, what happened in California absolutely meets the qualifications of the various definitions of genocide, or the various facets of genocide. So I bring that up just as a way to demonstrate, or at least illustrate, that there were some positive components. Yes, the positive components were this: we brought technology, we brought education, we brought innovation, right? The United States grew as a country, and in some ways this is a very positive thing. But there's always a negative side to it, and the negative side comes with the impact upon not only native peoples and Mexican peoples, but also upon the landscape. The environmental and the ecological damage that was wrought by Manifest Destiny was great. Again, we go back to California and we think about just the hydraulic mining that eventually was developed as a means of kind of moving mountains in order to get to the gold veins. So there's a lot to this idea of Manifest Destiny. And in some ways, I think we can look at things like the North Dakota pipeline and the Sioux that just happened a few years back, and the oil spills that are happening as pipelines were put across Native American lands. We can think back to the 1960s and the Occupy Alcatraz movement, where Native peoples attempted to retake Alcatraz. I think these are all episodes where we can see that this colonial process may very well still be in place. Can you roll the tide back on colonialism? Can we roll the tide back of Manifest Destiny? And did Manifest Destiny end in the 1850s? And the answer to that is no. Just because the United States acquired most of the land in the North American hemisphere, at least what now creates the United States, that didn't necessarily stop them. Just because the map turned blue, that is, we hit the Pacific Ocean, doesn't mean that our ambitions stopped. In fact, we will wage a war of imperialism in the Philippines and have a Philippine-American war at the turn of the century. And in fact, to this very day, we have access and control Puerto Rico, among other areas as well. So Manifest Destiny, I would argue, to this day is not necessarily dead. It's still there in fragments, and I'd be interested to know what you think about that. Do you agree with that? Do you disagree with that, and why? But that's kind of what we're looking at this week, and so I hope that you will enjoy the content. If you have questions, please let me know. Contact me. I'll get back to you. Otherwise, as always, go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you. Live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a blessed week, guys.